Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We are going live with Lizania Cruz today. We're waiting for her to join us. 1 second, please. Hello, everybody. Hola. Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us live. We're going to be talking about Lizania's practice. How are you doing?
I'm good. I wore lipstick for the first time since March. So
I know. I think it's one of my favorite parts about this series is that I get to once a week pretend like I'm going out.
yeah.
But I must confess that, sometimes I do the thing of like, I'm going to confess, I have flip-flops, like things like that.
I have Birkenstocks.
Yeah. I mean, we deserve at least comfort coming out from this, right? At least that. I mean, why would we use high heels in the house?
I don't know.
Yep. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. So we're very excited to talk to you about your practice. Lizania selected a series of works to talk. I don't know if you want to share with people where you are, in case somebody who doesn't know about you, where you come from originally, where you're living now, where are you during this pandemic? Some people are stranded in strange places.
No, I'm in my home in Brooklyn, and yeah, like right now I'm in my studio too, so it's kind of nice and sad because I'm leaving it soon. But I'm originally from the Dominican Republic and been living in New York for almost 10 years and in the US like around 15. And I came to finish my bachelor degree here. And so
here to New York. You always been here in New York or?
No, I came from the Dominican Republic to Philly. In the DR, I went to a school called Altos de Chabón, and it's like a 2-year program. And then I moved to Philly to finish my bachelor degree. Hi, Leslie. It's so funny. I see people saying hi.
Yeah, it's super nice.
Yeah.
It's very, a lot of friends showing up.
I study graphic design, and I think that is like reflected a lot in my practice and kind of like the tools and the strategies I use to do my work. So
true, a lot of like communication techniques. So let's start talking about one of the projects. I'm gonna put some images. Give me 1 second. So
cool. So yeah, I wanted to start with this. This is a project called We the News, and I've been doing this project since 2017. And it's a project I started with the support of the Laundromat Project. But I wanted to start with just like an idea of like a story circle. And basically the project is a traveling newsstand that documents, publishes, and distributes the stories of Black immigrants and first generation Black Americans. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to start with the story circle is because like people are very much the center of my work. But also this idea of like just like a plurality of voices and this project started as like a way I wanted to kind of like explore what was it like to tell ourselves our own news. I was like very frustrated with how media was portraying the immigrant narrative and almost kind of erasing the Black immigrant narrative. So I collaborated with Al, which is like my partner collaborator in this project, and he's like the first person to the left. And he's the main organizer for an organization called the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And yeah, this is basically like the first year of the project. All we did was to gather and invite folks to come and share their stories around like their immigrant experience. And we started the story circles oftentimes with like a prompt or like a passage of a poem, and then people are able to just respond to it. And because, again, I also think a lot in my practice about the public space and how the work is either created or shown in the public space. These story circles took place in, like, as we saw in the image before, like in a community garden. And this is in an organization that it's in Flatbush called Caribbean. So basically the process was, as you could see in this image, like I recorded the story circles, I transcribed them, and then edit them in collaboration with each of the participants. And with that edit, I make like a series of scenes. And so far we have like around 18 to 20 scenes. And those go into the newsstand. I think it's the same, the next image. And for the newsstand, I collaborated with an architect called Michael Durinsky. So as you can see, like already in my work, there's like a lot of collaboration and people involved. And I believe in sort of like honing or sharing expertise to sort of like decentralize the expertise. And I try to do that as like the best way I know so far. Sometimes I fail, sometimes it's successful. But
and you know, another side of what you just said, and it's something that somebody else who participated in this series mentioned recently, is that art gives, I mean, it's obviously the beauty of a collaborative, you know, work, and going beyond authorship, but also like the possibility to play to be something else, to play to be an anthropologist, to play to be a community organizer, to have that chance to experiment, you know, and to learn from the traits of other people doing other things.
Yeah, for sure. Like I learned so much from doing this project with Al, for instance, just on like the strategies of bringing people into the table, of making a space that is really non-hierarchical, like that, people feel welcome. And even, like I think I'm, like the project I'm working right now, I'm very much thinking of being like a criminal investigator. So it is like sort of that idea of like being able to wear that hat and sort of like play that character or persona in a way. But yeah, I also think that a lot of my practice is centered around deep listening and trying to see what, like listen and see what other folks bring into the project. Like for instance, in the newsstand, I knew that I would needed something that was like similar to a card. I knew that I wanted something that reflected like a box that then opened up. And a lot of the design ideas came from like the collaboration with Michael and sort of like the use of materials too. So I think that, it's like part of the process that I really enjoy of doing work.
Absolutely.
But yeah, these are, so when the newsstand is out, they're like in the street and I invite like artists, and they do also workshops at the sidewalk level. And I invite musicians, and then we have music, and then we have like different participatory aspects to it. So, like,
how do you feel like? I mean, how do you feel that the work transitions in between? Because I noticed reading about it, and when I was watching the news, just this, something very interesting about your practice is that it's participatory, it's groupal, it's community, but it's also has like a two-folded aspect where you start with a very private meeting, a very private situation that then goes into the public. And as you said, there's an editing on that, an editing that you do along with these other people, because you're also sharing their stories. It's a very private thing you're sharing. Not only the activity is private, so there's a passage in between the inside of the garden, the community center, and the outside when you're like vocalizing that. I mean, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that that's something that I'm super mindful of. For instance, if you see some of the zines, like there was one scene in particular that was with like a refugee, asylum seeker, and we were going back and forth because first there were things that he didn't want to share in public, and yet like there's creation of like that intimate space, and then being mindful of of like letting people know that this will be in the public sphere and sort of like in a sidewalk and in a way mass distributed. But also, like in his case, there were a lot of things that it was important for Baji's work, because these scenes are often used as tools for political education. They are used to go to, like ask for changes in legislature. So we went through like a process of editing with the participant, with the lawyer, and then with Baji. And I think that there were things that we kind of just used graphic techniques to make sure that people understood the things that we were omitting and changing. But I think that I consider those experiences, like a lot of the reason why I keep talking about participatory practice is because for me, if you participate in the story circle, but perhaps didn't want to share your story in a zine, or perhaps I didn't do the zine, you're already part of the experience, right? So I see them as like, you could either be part of the whole project, or you could experience the project in that specific state. So for me, the story circle, it's like the same as having like a conversation and understanding how like that agreements happen. So I guess like to answer your question, like I see them very much as like it's part of like a happening as well. So it's
but it's even I mean, and going back to your skills as a graphic designer, it's even like a media outlet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's interesting. I mean, that's another aspect, and it's an important aspect, I mean, that we tend to forget, because it seems like we think it is kind of old school because of the internet, but it's not, which is the idea of creating our own news, right? The importance of like community creating their own news is such an important aspect of like, the struggle for like, against inequality. We see this now. I mean,
and one of the things that I think like one of the things that was so special about the story circles was that, again, like the people that came into the story circles, like it's an interesting thing when you start to make connections with other people's stories and understand that perhaps, yes, your experience is unique, but there's like all these things that are interconnected and systematic. And I think that was one of the things that was really good for Baji to kind of like bring people into the organization. So yeah. But
absolutely. So let me go through the images. So I think, is this the right next image or did I make a mistake?
That one's good. So for instance, in this image, this is something that similar to what I was saying, like this is part of a happening that did last September, and it was, we took over Restoration Plaza, and basically we had the newsstand, we did a panel discussion, one of the participants, Julissa, shared her story. But this is interesting because it's like very pertinent to what's happening currently, and although I don't think I'm like the right person to talk about this, but Al was involved in this campaign that was to fund communities and not jails. And with a group called We Keep Us Safe, they were looking at kind of pushing back on the idea of de Blasio wanting to build 4 new jails. And what we did was, like, I told Al, what if we start asking people what to do, what $11 billion, what would they do in their community with it instead of 4 new jails? So this is like another way too that Al or like Baji uses the project to kind of like create community organizing. And this was just like in the sidewalk as well. So.
Absolutely.
And yeah, this is again, this is Julissa, and she was one of the participants, and she was like sharing her story with a group of folks. So again, like this idea of how do we take over public spaces and sort of like reclaim it with our stories is like at the center of this project.
Speaking about that, and I mean the public, I mean, I think this is interesting because you're combining the taking of the public space, but also the taking of the art world, right? I mean, because
yeah. I mean, I'm also interested in how could the art be more accessible to everyone, and yet, like, We the News has for sure been on like the white cube, and I've done different things to make it feel like it's also inviting participation, but I always feel like that it's not alive when it's on the white cube in some shape or form. It's almost like it becomes more of an object rather than a living thing in a way. So this was in Miami, and it was like part of Untitled, and this is super interesting because it was just such a struggle to have. First, we needed like permits and like all this other things around having just like this object outside of the fair, but I think it was like a struggle to get people to understand that I wanted to be outside and not inside, and sort of like this idea of like what is, like what space I occupied in this art world, which is I always think of like I'm in this in between, and I try to push the boundaries of where the project sits specifically. And for this one, like for instance, we had to get a permit. We couldn't get a megaphone, which is part of the idea of the happening. So I ended up doing like a paper megaphone and sort of like sharing the stories and reading. I did like 3 readings throughout the happening that afternoon. So it was actually really fun, and it was interesting to be in a space where there was like a lot of Latin folks, and there was like a lot of conversation around Blackness that I haven't had in New York, for instance, because I think that's also something that I'm very interested to see with, again, going back to conversations as like perhaps a form of art making or like this dialogue. When the newsstand is in the streets, I'm also very interested to have these conversations and think about ways that I can bring up, like, again, this idea of, you know, Blackness is not a monolithic, and it's like a multiplicity of forms. So,
yeah, and for any Anglo-Saxon or like person who doesn't know about it, I mean, even a lot of Latinos don't know about it. I mean, there's so much to learn about race in the Americas, right? And especially in Latin American countries. So much to learn. And yes, so I think it's very interesting in a place like Miami, right? Which in a way is almost like, I mean, we Latin Americans like to think of Miami as part of our continent, like the last bit, the northern part of our continent, right?
Yeah, it sort of is like people don't even speak English that as
I know
there.
I know. But I wanted to go back to something that they mentioned 2 times already, which is the idea of the in-between. And I think it's very interesting to highlight that because you said it with regards to different things. You said it with regards like people, you know, you said it with regards to ideas, but you also said it with regards to your own positioning, you know, as an artist and as a person. And, you know, and I think that's very rich because it's the idea of the in-between. It's an operative term. I mean, I studied in my own research about migrant artists in the 1970s, and it's something that keeps coming back, right? And Homi Bhabha writes about it. It's this idea of like being in between cultures, being in between like frameworks, being in between moments in history. And, you know, but I like that at the same time, that contrasts with the physicality of your artwork, which is like all over the place. You know, you have the scenes and then you have the stand, and then your work is also the conversation and the placement and the action and the meetings around it and the social effect that it produces. So, I mean, in a way, the media in your work is also in between disciplines, right? So
yeah, I guess I've never thought about it that way, but yeah, in a way, there's like, I guess if you think about the materiality of it, there is like this stage of, you know, I think a lot about the archive, right? And I feel that perhaps like the things I'm doing and these happenings are the in-between to eventually the archive, which is sort of like the space that consolidates, or I don't know, it's kind of like the place that becomes like the historical reference, if you could say. But I do think that, yeah, I don't know, I lost my train of thought because I
No, it's okay. I mean, it wasn't such an organized proposal either. It was just thinking out loud with you about it. I thought it was a very rich idea that is all over the place.
Yeah, and in a way, I think that I'm interested in that in between because I'm very much interested in sort of like building this process with the participants and with like the people that come into the work. So I'm very, you know, particular about the framework, but I am less rigid about the outcomes of the content, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Anyway, let's go to the next work.
Yeah, this is a project I did at Recess, and it's called 200 From To With Love. And I've been interested in remittances for super long time, and this idea, again, living in the in-between of like
exactly
the money that migrants send back home while they're here. So I think that I I'm interested in talking about migration from all these different aspects. And, you know, like the economic aspect is something that is like often talked about, but very little talked about from the perspective of what happens in like our home countries. Like, you know, a lot of people like to talk about immigrants here like are doing all the work, or like taking the work, like taking jobs or what have you. But we often forget like the value of the dollar, and how that, you know, just like ramificates into other countries. So this project was looking at this in particular, and I invited participants that were coming into the gallery to leave a receipt. And then I did like a series of collages that was comparing how much like, you know, if you bought a coffee for $4, how much $4 could buy of corn or rice in like a place like Honduras, or plantains in the DR. And I collaborated with a good friend of mine who's an economist, and his name is Agustin Indaco. And we worked on like a chart of looking again, you know,
this is a chart.
One of the 15 countries that receive more remittances in like outside of the United States. And when I mean remittance, I mean like the amount that was sent to, like the last year the data was recorded on remittances was 2016, and this is $5 billion. So it's like an insane, and it's only money that is sent out of the US. So I asked people to leave a receipt from like 1 to 200, and they put their names and what did they spend that money on. And then I did like a series of collages with that, with those receipts. So I think it's like that.
So it was $5 billion, you said.
$500 billion that's sent, that was sent in 2016 out of the US. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
So, yeah. And this was like the wall that people like, that you receive like a little kind of like pocket thing. I think I have one.
Oh, lovely. That's it.
So yeah, basically these were like the pockets. And then inside the pocket, people left like the receipts. So collected like, I don't know, like around 80 of these. And yeah, people put like, okay, this is like the amount they spent, this was in what they spent it, and then like their names. So then with that, I took the receipts, scanned it, and created like a series of collages, which I think is the next image. Yeah. So basically one
this
of
is probably where it's tall.
Yeah, is like one of the receipts. And for instance, like the first one I made while I was in the residency, it was like one popcorn in a movie theater here, and that you could buy 13 kilos of corn in Honduras, and one popcorn was like $5. So it's like interesting to kind of, it was like bringing into perspective to visitors, like that oftentimes, you know, we come here for, you know, let's say opportunities, and but we forget that we also have like a changing sphere in like our home countries. And I was talking with a scholar for this project. Her name is Sarah Lewis, and she has like a lot of she has a book that is talking about how architecture has changed in places like Mexico and Honduras, just from the remittances people send. And not only it has changed by the way how people design their homes and where people design their homes. Some of them have like, a mini Statue of Liberty. So it's sort of like interesting to learn about just again, like how the migration movement shapes like not only the US, but all around the world. So
yeah. But it also, and going back, just because I also think, sorry, I have a cat. Just because like my cat is trying to say hi. Just say hi for real
hi.
And then go.
Oh my God.
Sorry. Yeah. I think it's interesting going back to this idea of the in-between that you're mentioning, right? That just because it's almost becoming like a guiding term, like a motto, right? Because there's something about many of us who are migrants who have our, like you said, first generation migrants, right? Or second generation migrants, where you have immediate family that you grew up with in your home country, you kind of just detach from it and you live in these like two realities. And when you're thinking about money, and money is such a clear way. I think it's so rich that you did that, because even for, middle class educated, privileged people like me, sometimes when I think about money, I think about the things that I could do with this, in Argentina, where I came from, right? But at the same time, I know that if I go back, I wouldn't be earning in this currency. So it's like, yeah. No, of course, I'm a bad example because but
no, it's like that. I think that how the project started was, it's actually quite expensive to send money internationally, and I was interested around like the conversation of how migrants do banking, and that was like kind of how I got into the project. And it's interesting that some countries it's even more expensive and of course that has to do with like supply and demand and like the infrastructure of the country. But I also think that there's a monopoly, like systematic monopoly, because if I don't have, let's say, access to a Venmo account or a bank account, I cannot do a like my only possibilities are around using Monogram or like these services. So
or Western, absolutely.
So how I got into the project, and as like this work develops, if it develops, how I got into the project was just from like a lens of how these systems are also exploitative, and why it is like the amount that is like mostly sent. The most common amount is $200 to $300, and that's where like the title for the work comes from. And some places like Haiti, to send $200 could be as expensive as like $10. And when we are talking, and I think one of the things that we lose sight of is that when we're talking about the difference that $200 could make in another country, $10 is like a big amount. You might not think about it because we pay $4 for a latte, and but I think that was like my interest point into doing this work. And then as I was developing it, I thought it was I thought it was more impactful to talk about kind of like the macro idea of it, versus just like this is like the money that it's being like people are spending.
But it's super important, because what you're discussing there is not simply, a matter of economic currency or finance or the way the world works in like late stage capitalism. It's a problem of value, It's a problem of like the value of the work of people, right? And why my work is valued more here than it is in a different country. And at the same time, you know.
Started at that because like even now, like, you know, with COVID, there's like this article that I keep thinking about, and I don't know what's gonna come out of it, but I've been very interested in this idea of like who's essential, pretty much, you know.
Absolutely.
And there was like a piece in the Times that was talking about how all these farm workers who are undocumented and basically are constantly in fear of ICE, they got a letter that said that they were essential, so they didn't need to worry about ICE in the time of COVID. So for me, that is just like, that is like a mind-blowing. And talking back to what we value and who has value, and what kind of work has value.
And at the same time, I'm not sure we would have to check this, but I also read a news about that population, about migrant workers, that migrant farmer workers, that Congress in the last bill ended up reducing their hourly salary, which was already below, you know, state and national like minimums, because they had a special status as a way to compensate for the aid that the same government is giving other people. So, you know,
I read about that. Yeah,
you're essential, but you're paid less. Maybe that is the case. We don't know. We will have to compare these. But let's go back to your practice, which discusses this in any way. So anyway, I want to make sure we get to talk about the Flowers Project also. So please, sorry.
So again, like, I mean, talking about Inbetween, this piece, it's called Livia Juanita, and I wanted to, I've been considering in my practice a lot how I bring my own narrative to it as well, and how I start creating, you know, objects that are in line to the stories I'm trying to tell. And with this specifically, when I was a kid, my cousin and like my grandfather's aunt, my grandfather's sister used to come from New York into the DR, and this piece is called Livia Juanita because I was obsessed with the smell of their suitcase from New York. And basically, you know, me and my friends, we used to joke like, oh, that smells like New York. Like when we got something, when we got like a gift or any clothes, we would not wash it. But I think it also talks about this, like the idealization of migrating, right? And when I moved to Philly, I learned right away that this smell that I loved so much was actually just detergent, because like we didn't have Tide, we didn't have Bounty, we didn't have washing machines, you know, like at that time, not like, so like the detergent that we used was completely different.
Yeah, of course.
So this piece, I collaborated with a friend of mine, perfumer, Tatiana Godoy, and we basically infused a perfume that was infused with Tide, and we used like the Bounty sheets to filter the perfume. We used Soiled from New York. So it's sort of like the metaphor of, you know, you have like this idea and ideals of coming to America, and then you realize that maybe that is not so much true, and you know, that this is the smell of Tide.
But at the same time, it's an amazing project, and I love it because you're talking about like you know, it's almost like you were creating your own like future. You know how smell is one of the main elements for melancholia and for remembrance, you know, and like smell is something that we don't think so much about. We haven't developed like as humans, like our sense of smell so much in the last ever since we evolved, like develop our language and the same way we
Yeah.
develop our site. So we kind of kept smell to the side, but at the same time, it's super powerful. And when we do remember a smell, like if you feel the sense of like the perfume that your grandmother, who you haven't seen for a long time or passed away, smell, you'll start crying, So I love that you had this like memory of the smell of your aunt that for you was a memory was the smell of a place that you had never been to. So it was like a fake, nostalgia for a place that, I mean, maybe you've been to New York, but you know my point.
It was, for me, it was like, I've always, like you cherish this smell. So, and it was actually quite interesting because a lot of people, I had like a friend who is from Colombia and came to see the show, and she was like, oh my God, this is like the smell of Miami. So it's kind of like, I had like a really amazing response to the work that was someone that was like a first generation American, but of Indian parents. And she was saying that this smelled like her friends when she was a kid, because she was always like in her house, like the smell was like the smell of spices. And she always wanted to so it's kind of like talking to what you were saying. We have this attachment to memory, and I think that is like definitely a powerful tool. So
and almost sometimes even an unavoidable tool. The thing about smell is that you cannot block it. You gotta like close your nose forever. You're gonna smell. Anyway, sorry, I want to make sure, because we have like 15 minutes before they're gonna cut us up, but I think we have enough time. Anyway,
you want to go to because this is also part of the same project.
Let's go to this one.
So this is Flowers for Immigration, and it's like a project I started in 2016, and it's ongoing. And basically, I saw a stat that said that 70% of the flowers that we buy here in New York are not grown or local to New York, and they come from places like Colombia and Mexico. And I was interested to see if we could look at flowers as immigrants. And at the time, I was doing a lot of flower arrangements and buying flowers from some bodegas that were like around my house. And I knew that the guys working there were undocumented. And it was like at the time that Trump was like running for president. So I was like, and I was also interested in kind of like dismantling this idea of the melting pot, which is something that I've always hated, and sort of think that I'm curious to live in a city that, or live in a country that we could, again, just show up as our individual selves and not have to assimilate. And what would that mean? So I saw the arrangement as like a way to talk about this, of a way, like in a flower arrangements, all the flowers are have their individual personality and aesthetic, but then they come together and they make this beautiful arrangement. So I asked the workers to make a flower arrangement for Trump and sort of like interview them on why they picked the flowers that they picked, and just like what was their journey to, like the US, and what did they thought of Trump as like, and mind you, this was like before he was president. Like this is, he was running to be president, and it was like he gave a speech in Phoenix where he basically talked about, how criminal we are. And I was so infuriated, and I sort of like needed to do something. So I interview the workers, I buy the arrangements from them, and then I show the work with the interviews. And typically I show it as a triptych because, again, it's like I'm interested in this idea of like the flowers as individuals and then the flowers as the arrangement. And sort of like making a portrait of, you know,
which is also a letter, you know, that's super interesting also as a portrait, but it's also a letter for, you know, has a dedication.
It has, it kind of, so like in the cover is sort of like, you know, from to, and I also talk about, because flowers are also symbols, you know, each country picks the flower as like their national flower. So I'm also interested in that idea of like this symbol and what it represents. So
yeah, and they also have a function. Certain flowers are for, you know, for relate to love occasions,
exactly.
Another to sad occasions like death.
Yeah, they're like a form of communication. So
absolutely.
I also was interested in like in how can we talk about, how can we represent and show these stories without showing the faces of the people, because I think that that's also something that is like often co-opted.
And which is very interesting. This is, I mean, this type of display is very interesting in that regard.
Yeah. So this was, I was invited to be part of a show in Portland, Maine, and it was like a collective called Border Patrol, and they basically took they had the show in the series of, I think it was 4 months or 3 months, and they took these like ad displays. And this is the Miguel's arrangement. And I love this arrangement so much because he specifically said, I want to use flowers that are wilting. I want to use flowers that are dying already. And I thought it was like super poetic. And yeah, this work was up for, I think, a total of 3 days. It was supposed to be up for a month. And
oh, really? Let me show it in detail for
it was yeah, exactly. It was so there you could see sort of like the interview, and he's talking about how he, you know, like he picks flowers that are dying, and perhaps these flowers are for Trump's funeral. And then he also picked like a pepper. You could see like above. Then he's like, I'm gonna use a pepper so he knows I'm from Mexico. But yeah, this piece was like was taken down on day 3, and apparently there was some complaints about the work, and the mall said that malls are typically like a stress-free environment. So
so you can buy stress-free. Yeah,
exactly. So I was sad, but again, I was like very excited to have this work be shown in a space that perhaps is like not totally public, but it is sort of like blurring the boundaries of that.
That is great. So I don't know, we have a few minutes, and I would love to open to see if anybody in the audience has any questions. Natalia, Dani, and I mean, thank you for being here. Yeah.
So,
but meanwhile, I mean, I wanted to bring up, you know, how interesting. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat box and we'll share. But I mean, I wanted to go back also and kind of like go back to the images again and share a little bit, I mean, about these common aspects that we notice, which is like, this emphasis in the graphic design that we mentioned right at the beginning. But at the same time, this idea of like media, and this idea of like working with communication and like creating new like media outlets in a way. In this case, the letter, the portrait, but at the same time, the fanzine, the newspaper, and then these charts, informational charts.
Yeah.
And then this idea of the in-between a public project, the in-between, the genre and materialities in which you shift around, which relates so much with the topic that you're working on throughout your work, which is like this idea of like migration and having your affect and your, and your mind in between two different spaces while you might be living in or making a new life in the US, but at the same time having your family in the Americas.
I'll just join. Al is
hello.
A collaborator for We the News.
Who is here? We were talking about you, Al. Hi, very nice to meet you. He's here, right, in this photo?
Yeah.
That's great.
Someone asked a question about...
Yes, if you're working in a new project. Yeah, you want to share something about that?
Hey. Yes, I am working on 2 new projects. One is around, I'm doing, like I was saying before, I'm doing a project that's called An Investigation on the Racial Dominican Imaginary. And I'm looking at archives and inviting people to participate as they do testimonies. And I'm interested in mapping out what events, like how, when our idea of like the ideas of our Afro descendancy got erased from our imaginary and in our archive. And I'm thinking about the archive both as like national archives, but like the body as an archive, and sort of like our stories as archive and news as archive. So it is sort of like a criminal investigation, and I'll be showing that at A.I.R gallery next year, so I'm super excited. And then the other thing I'm working on is, like we just had COVID, and it's like this idea of like how do we just like on our ideals and then grieving our ideals, and what does that look like? I don't know yet, but a lot of the things I've been reading about are just like the safety social net and the things that we should demand from government, but at the same time, the ideals that we have from government. So those are 2 things that are kind of like that I've been reading about and learning more. And I don't know yet what the shape of that project will be. Most likely would be an online platform that maybe gets like exhibited or transformed into the public space. But I've also been interested in how could anyone from around the world contribute to the project. So yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Did any of your projects got delayed because of COVID? I mean, everybody's life got postponed, delayed, suspended, but I mean.
I got a lot of I had like a few shows that was in this year that are happening next year. And in a way, I'm fortunate that I could take a pause and just kind of like reassess and read. I've just been reading a lot. I don't feel like when I'm working, I'm researching, but now I'm kind of like reading a novel.
That's great.
Yeah.
Defending the right for pleasure, right? As one of the...
Yeah, trying, it's like, it's such every day I feel like it's a roller coaster. And I think like as we've met, we talk about this, like, 1 hour I feel okay, and the next hour I'm like, what is happening? But yeah, I've been sort of like trying to sit with things and think about, think a little bit more about things.
Okay, we only have like a few more minutes left, but maybe we can or at least share this question very quick. Social justice through art. How do you go about choosing where your work is seen? Are you actively looking for those opportunities, or do places reach out to you?
I think it's like a combination of both. Like I'm actively looking, and I'm actively applying for things, and at the same time, because I think that's shifting, but I'm not like an object maker, so I don't have like it's hard for a gallery to wrap their head around how they're gonna
tell your people,
like what they're gonna do with my work. And then I get opportunities that I get reached out through curators and people that have worked with me in the past. So but also because your work is so community based, I mean, it makes sense that you become part of that community. You get involved with the people you're working with, and communities relate to other communities, and that keeps it flowing. Yeah, and I also think that it takes time. Like that's something that I'm super mindful, and I try to remind people that, some of these projects, or most of these projects, are like 2
years long research.
So it's kind of like, again, I think because we live in this like capitalist moving world, we forget that you have to build community, then you have to like do the work, then you sort of have to present it. So that takes time.
Anyway, I want to make sure we have a moment to say goodbye, and I wanted to thank you and everybody who's been watching, a very faithful audience. I noticed a lot of people like making comments and seeing it all through it. Thank you, gracias. Thank you. It was a wonderful